understand was the price per bushel of apples increased from $7 to $8 because of a poor harvest. So the answer that the test said is right is quantity of apples demanded decreases. And what I answered was the quantity of apples demanded decreases, but also is the quantity of supply decreases because of the poor harvest. And so I got that wrong.
So I was just quickly trying to mentally take down some notes as you were going. So the price of apples, what was, we were in the apple market, not like apple juice market,
No,
but apple
apples,
market.
bad
Okay,
harvest.
so we got price of apples, quantity of apples, and all they said was that the price of apples went up
Due to a poor harvest.
due to a poor harvest. Okay, so presumably a supply shift or poor harvest due to frost, kind of like our early frost type examples, right?
Right.
And from the answers you had available, you had quantity demanded, but then you also had, you said that you had also put quantity supplied or something like that?
Yeah, I answered that both demand and quantity supply decreases.
Okay. So, how do you think you're right? Because in a sense, you've got an argument.
Yeah.
Or why did you put that?
Because it was a poor harvest, so there was going to be less apples supplied. And they are not taking into account the poor harvest part, they're just saying the quantity of apples demanded decreases because of price.
Okay.
I answered both of those.
Okay. So there is a distinction, just to kind of keep the lingo straight, of there's a decrease in supply versus a decrease in quantity supplied. So when we talk about quantity supplied, we're usually thinking back to the law of supply. So increased price leads to a decrease, increase in case, talk about supply. Increase in quantity supplied, not increase in supply. And so that, from a lingo standpoint, that's the part that gets a little slippery. So that's the part, whenever you see in a problem, quantity supplied or supply, that's what they're referring to, like the difference between a shift versus a movement along the curve. Does that help?
And so because the answer was specifically quantity supply decreases rather than supply decreases or supply shifts,
Yeah.
then that's why they're saying it's wrong.
Yeah.
Okay.
The thing that, there's a new equilibrium quantity. So the only part where I said this does get a little tough and a little bit with the wording, but if you go from this equilibrium, now I'm saying the words equilibrium here, from Q1 to Q2, at the new equilibrium, the quantity supplied, because of the supply shift, is actually less than what it was before, right? Because it's a new equilibrium. So that's where it gets a little bit tough. But so just quantity supplied, think about the movement along, change in supply, shift up. Okay, any other questions? Okay. By the way, I did this on your first test, and I don't think I told you. Maybe I did. I think I forgot, now that I'm thinking about it. I look through the tests, and if I see some problems that a bunch of you missed, like more people missed than not, then I'll go back in and review that problem and potentially throw it out. So your scores might adjust sometimes after I review that, and I didn't get an opportunity to review it from this Tuesday one yet, so I will be doing that. So, any questions on tests? Okay. So, we learned about deals last time. So, let me just get rid of this here. So we talked about Chapter 5 stuff of consumer surplus and producers. And so before we dive back into where we left off, I want to call back to your attention the basic market that now includes the government. So we've added the government to our marketplace. We now have another agent, an economic agent. We have producers who are really just a group of people who are sometimes households, bear in mind, but that we're going to consider them an economic agent, a firm, a group of people that are looking to do maximize profits. We've got households, which hopefully we're comfortable with, those people trying to make themselves as happy as possible. And now we've got the government involved in possibly the provision of public goods, which is a topic we'll cover later, and all the types of activities we discussed last time. So as we jump into this welfare analysis, what do we think about the welfare of people? So a lot of what economics has to offer or bring to the table is looking at the impact of government policy or possibly free market policy or problems with pollution. What is the impact that that event has on the people we care about or the agents in the economy? So we can start to think about the welfare of society by looking at the welfare of consumers, the welfare, and when I say the word welfare now, I'm not talking food stamps and the poor. I'm talking about the well-being, right? The well-being of households, the well-being of businesses, and possibly the well-being of government in terms of how their budgets are doing with spending and taxes. Okay, our first stop then on this three-part train is with the consumers. And so last time we defined consumer surplus, which was, I won't rewrite it again, the difference between what a consumer is willing to pay and what they actually pay for each unit consumed. So let me start with a bare naked demand curve here. The demand curve shows the benefit that a consumer is getting for each additional unit is the definition that we use. So we also called it the marginal benefit curve for consumers. So imagine if we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and maybe we're all out to 9, and we're looking at the quantity of Red Bull. So somebody out there is willing to pay a lot of money for that first Red Bull. So somebody out there is willing to pay $10 a can. Another person is willing to pay $9 a can. Somebody else is willing to pay $8 a can. And so on. I might not have actually drawn this to scale, so I better stop there. The point is that the benefit of each unit consumed is actually the height of the full demand curve. So this red distance, this red height, represents the benefit from the third Red Bull to some consumer, to one consumer. Whoever consumed that good got $8 worth of benefit. So $8 of marginal benefit. I add on, I guess, the marginal part. And that is the height of the demand curve. Okay, so that kind of sets the stage, and then the price of the Red Bull is going to be whatever it's going to be. And we'll usually have a market in there, so I did it a little bit differently last time. So this time, let me just put on here, let's say the price of a Red Bull is $3. So if this represents the market price, presumably that means that there's some supply curve here. In fact, maybe for simplicity, let me just, hopefully not confusion, but simplicity, let's suppose a perfectly elastic supply curve at $3. So the Red Bull people are willing to supply as many as people want to buy at $3. So now this person gets $8 worth of benefit it cost them $3, so we got to subtract the $3 off. The height of this represents the price that they paid of $3, and so they're getting a net benefit of $5. That is consumer surplus. So this orange area represents the consumer surplus of the third Red Bull. All right, so that's kind of the dichotomy of the consumer surplus. You're paying something, you would be willing to pay more, but you don't have to, and so you get this deal. You got a deal of $5. Does anybody have any questions on that?
Why is 8 the height curve?
I just made up 8, so at 3 units, somebody was willing to pay $8. So the height here is 8.
So it could be anywhere on it, it would be the height of demand.
Yes, and it changes if we go to another unit. If we go to the first unit, somebody was willing to pay $10 for that one. So we have people ordered by their willingness to pay. The people with the highest willingness to pay are the early units, and then we start to get more and more people wanting to buy, the cheaper it goes. Okay, we'll come back to that story a little bit when we get into the chapter 7. Okay, any other questions?
What does CS stand for?
Consumer surplus. Good. That's the type of thing we want to flush out. Don't be bashful. Any other questions? All right, so producers have some surplus too. So producer surplus, PS, is the difference between what a producer actually receives which would usually be, in many cases, the price, so the market price, and the minimum amount. And the minimum amount it requires, which is the marginal cost. For each unit sold. For each unit sold. Okay, so for this one, let's draw a home base picture. So hopefully you're getting good at that. Home base, downward sloping demand, upward sloping supply, equilibrium price and quantity gets established. No shortage, no surplus. We have equilibrium. So, let's see, give me a good, any good?
Price.
Honey. Honey. I think I heard, I didn't quite hear that one, so let's go honey. All right, so the price of honey, quantity of honey, and a jug of honey is running $10 is the market price of honey. All right, so if there's 100 bottles of honey being sold in total, the difference between what they were willing to pay, or what they were willing to take, the minimum amount they needed, and the amount they actually got, varies by each quantity. and again, that's a topic we'll get to later, but the supply curve is the marginal cost curve. We saw that when we looked at opportunity cost in chapter 2. And so the gist of it here is that the 50th jar of honey, costs us $5, the height of the supply curve. The 50th jar of honey cost us $5, but we actually sold it for 10. Which means we got this surplus, which is very similar to profit. But it's not quite profit, so I don't want to go down that path. Probably fair to say the profit on the 50th unit. I'm okay with that. So we sold it for 10 bucks. The 50th unit cost us $5. We got $5 worth of producer surplus on the 50th unit. Now for the 25th jar of honey, that one cost us less. Maybe it was $3. Again, I'm just making up some numbers to motivate things. So on the 25th jar of honey, we made $7. On the 75th jar of honey, we were up to $8 worth of cost for the 25th unit and only made then $2. So we keep adding up all of the incremental amounts that we had for each jar of honey, and that gives us the producer surplus area, which ends up being this orange area of this triangle. All right, so what about the producer surplus on the 100th unit? Question mark. According to this definition, what was the producer surplus on the 100th unit? Zippo. Right. So 0 producer surplus on the last unit produced, but the area of this triangle does give us an amount of dollars. And so if this intercept was 1, and it's not too big a deal if you don't have this drawn to scale, obviously mine's not drawn to scale either, but let's put this supply curve intersecting the vertical axis here at 1. We now can calculate the area of that triangle. So that area is producer surplus. The producer surplus on the 100th unit is 0. The producer surplus for all units sold is the area of that triangle. And what is the area of a triangle? What's that formula from geometry class? 1/2 base times height. Good. 1/2 base times height. In this case, we've got 1/2 of a base of 100, right? So we got 100 units. And we've got a height of how much? 9. So be careful with that one. It's up to 10, but there was a 1 at the intercept, so the height is $9, giving us $450. So again, this is similar to a profit. So let's put on kind of a note here. This is similar to profit, but not quite the same. But not quite. More on this in future chapters. for now, let's just put more on this later. Okay, questions on producer surplus? Now, since I got this one conveniently up here, let's go ahead and say that the demand curve up here intersects at, let's make it $19. What is the consumer surplus? So let's make this kind of a separate deal. What is consumer surplus for honey? Anybody got an answer yet?
It'd be the same.
It'd be the same, right? Why?
Because your lengths are the same.
It just happens to be the same, right? So I got 9 here for a height. So we're still doing 1/2 of base times height. So consumer surplus area would be this blue region. That's the consumer surplus. It happens to be a triangle. I'll just tell you right now, it doesn't always have to be a triangle. We're going to get into more sophisticated cases later. But we've got a triangle. So what is the consumer surplus for honey? Consumer surplus is equal to that little area there, which happens to be a triangle again, 1/2 base times height, which is, with the numbers we're using, maybe I'll even do one extra step here this time. 1/2 of the base, which is 100 minus 0, times the height, which is $19 minus $10, equals 450. And then you got all the nuts and bolts of the problem. Yes?
So it's not always going to be the same.
Yeah, and I'm kind of kicking myself for actually making it the same. I wasn't thinking about that. I kind of wish I would have made it different. So I guess it proves one point, but then maybe leads you down a path later that's not so good. So so we better put that as a note. Note, this is a weird case.
You say it's an anomaly.
Sure. They usually do not equal each other. Which, with the magic of a golf club, might be easier to show now that Mallory's provided me with a new case. You're going to bring this every class? Or? Okay.
Totally.
She has her golf, first time I've ever had a nice one at that, golf bag for my golf clubs. So you can see right away that it doesn't have to be. That's easy to show, right? If I rotate my demand curve a little bit so that I've got the intersection point still at the same spot, but the intercept's way up here, we got a big old triangle for consumer surplus, right? And a little one there. Same thing could be done with the supply curve. If I drop this down to the origin, then that triangle becomes bigger. Okay? Any other questions? Comments?
That wasn't a triangle at all.
It actually was a triangle. Because supply would equal demand here, then we'd still have consumer surplus. Oh, yeah, no, I'm sorry, you were talking about producer surplus.
Consumer surplus. That
what's
between the 8 and the
It's not.
Yeah, this is, no, I'm glad you brought this up. This is a good one to come back to now, to fly back to. So consumer surplus is a triangle, right? But you were thinking about producers maybe.
Well, no, when you, between the 8 and the 3, you drew the point over, you marked off in orange, and then,
Well, let's just step back from the problem for a sec.
okay,
This is the supply curve.
3,
This is the demand curve. Supply equals demand gives us the equilibrium price, and this would be the equilibrium quantity. So consumer surplus is the difference between what you're willing to pay and what you actually pay for each unit consumed. So that gives us this, I'm just going to mark this up, that gives us that triangle. But what's the producer surplus?
That right.
Is the more interesting one for this one.
It's a
It's the
rectangle.
rectangle.
It's the rectangle. No. What? It's not the rectangle, folks. Sorry. Look at this. Look at this definition here. The difference between what a producer actually receives, how much are they receiving?
$3.
$3. And the minimum amount it requires for each unit sold, the marginal cost. How much do they need at a minimum for the third unit? It's 3. What about the second unit?
It's 3.
3. First unit. 3, 3, 3, 3, 3. So the supply curve, in this case, has a constant marginal cost. Every unit can be supplied at a cost of $3. So this is one of our oddball cases that I was going to cover a little bit later, but now this is perfect timing. 0 producer surplus. There's just none of that surplus to it. Okay? So for this one, if you guys want to just add back maybe on your notes, you can put note, producer surplus equals 0 for this example. Because price equals marginal cost for all units sold. So now that we're on that theme, let me go golf clubbing again. What happens to the consumer surplus if demand becomes perfectly elastic at $10? No consumer surplus, right? So as the golf club starts to drop,
Good luck, Dale.
if demand looks like this, if this is our demand curve, then all of that blue area got kind of squished out of there, and there's none of it. So that's another extreme case where there'd be no consumer surplus.
Inelastic.
Perfectly inelastic. Demand?
Yes.
Okay, good question. What's the answer?
There'd be no consumer surplus.
No consumer surplus?
There'd be
Infinite consumer surplus, right? You know, that cocaine addict is willing to pay anything for the 50th bag of Coke, right? And so they get an infinite amount of the infinite amount of consumer surplus when they only have to pay $10 for their habit.
That was strong.
So that's a pretty good deal for them. They get lots of consumer surplus. So yes, that would end up being infinity. We'd shoot it right up through the roof. Okay. So yes, we got to think about how elasticity, and that's why we spent some time in the previous chapter, in chapter 4, because the concept of elasticity is an important one. It changes the answers, changes the results in a multiple number of ways. All right. Any other questions or comments?
That would be if the demand was straight up, right?
Yeah. Perfectly inelastic.
Yes.
Demand stream.
In fact, I'm going to go through those cases next. So let's just, since we got the juices flowing, we will think about some extreme cases. Consumer and producer surplus. Maybe this could be a nice little quiz here. Let's just put some on the board. All right, let's do extreme surpluses. 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's do a regular old demand curve and a perfectly inelastic supply. Let's do a perfectly elastic demand and a regular old supply. Let's do we already did that one. Let's see. Starting to run out of them here. What do we got? Regular old, perfectly, well, I guess this would be
Elastic supply.
And so inelastic demand is the one we just did kind of conceptually what we did for that. All right. So with each of these, just find where the market would go to in equilibrium, which is where the two lines cross. Kind of our home base for all of these extreme cases. And while you go, let me give you one tip while you do this. Start from left to right with either the producer or the consumer. I tend to usually start with the consumer. And just ask yourself, what are they willing to pay? What do they actually pay for each unit consumed? And it'll just start to mark itself out. Because again, they might not always be triangles. So we're actually consuming the equilibrium quantity. So if I start from left to right and I go willing, actual, willing, actual, willing, actual, willing, actual, willing, actual, boom, there's consumer surplus. And for the producers, difference between what they're willing to pay and the minimum amount. So with a perfectly inelastic supply, the producer surplus is all gravy, right? So actual, minimum is the supply curve. So you're always staying above the supply curve. If we come down to this one, this is kind of more of our traditional case. We're actually going to get the equilibrium price, minimum, actual minimum, actual minimum, actual minimum, staying above the supply curve. There it is. Here we've got nothing. Consumer has nothing here. Consumer's got willing, actual, willing, actual, willing, actual. And down here, the consumer's got an infinite amount of surplus. The producer is able milling here, producer surplus. So consumer surplus equals infinity here. Producer surplus is identified. Producer surplus equals 0 here. These are kind of the oddities. Consumer surplus equals 0 in this case. Producer has something. And in this case, they're both defined. But producer surplus equals the rectangle instead of the triangle.
Thank you.
All right, so we have not talked about the government. So we've had kind of our free market home base, our theoretical construct for now to use as a comparison. And for welfare analysis, we're going to add up everybody's welfare. So the welfare for society, the well-being, if you will, so we kind of got that term, not talking about being poor here. The well-being for society is the sum of the surpluses. So consumer surplus plus producer surplus plus government, if any, and this is government revenue. We'll talk more about that. I didn't want to leave that one off because I thought it would be confusing even though we're not really there yet. Consumer surplus, producer surplus, and the government, if we add all these up, we have an idea of society's welfare. Where it starts to get interesting is if there's a change. So if the supply in this market, let me take this market. If the supply gets cut in half, what happens to consumer welfare? Does it go up or down? It goes down, right? So we're going to be chipping away at that triangle. And if the supply gets cut in half, producers also lose welfare. So now we're starting to see how we can gauge changes, and ultimately we're going to look at government policies that create changes to the quantities exchanged and the prices in the market. So the translation here is that we can also think about the changes. The change in consumer surplus, plus the change in producer surplus, plus the change in government revenue, taking into consideration all three agents in the economy, we can look at the net effect. So this is the net change in welfare. So it's kind of two different ways. They're related to each other. One looks at the changes of where we started and where we ended, and one looks at the absolute amounts. They work in tandem with each other. And that is what we're going to get to, not today, but I want to give you another reminder for Friday to bring this sheet especially. So we've got a market, and then what we're going to do is we're going to apply a whole bunch of government policies and analyze the impact to each of the agents from those policies. Okay, questions or comments on that? So remember this little delta, I'm going to use that a little bit, that's kind of a math thing here. That is just shorthand notation for the change, or the change in consumer surplus. Okay. Well, I think it might be useful to go ahead and do a quick one maybe with the stuff I introduced before with the rent controls. Just to apply one little thing. So let's put an example here. What is the consumer surplus after a price ceiling is imposed? What is the consumer surplus after a price ceiling is imposed? So start with home base. This is the example we went through before when we did a price ceiling. The market was going to be clearing at $800 for that 2-bedroom apartment. And I don't know if did we put a quantity? I think it was 100 apartment units maybe. Does that sound right? Everybody
Yeah.
got it down on their
Start
notes?
out at, it was 700.
Okay, I just want to play off of that. So, and then the ceiling was what? 700 or 500?
Ceiling you put in place was 500.
500. Okay, so let's just go back and kind of redo that. So, at a ceiling of $500, let's go back and answer this question. What is the consumer surplus after the price ceiling is imposed? So I'm going to walk around the room. You can work with your neighbor. Let me see how you're doing. There's your setup. I want you to shade the consumer surplus area, just like what we did, except now with the price ceiling in effect. And you can look back at your old notes. We had a few more details that came along with the price ceiling.
It's illegal to price, yeah. That's what I was trying to show you.
Yes, just the consumer surplus.
And why do they have a price of $700? That's
That's
before.
like what the price was. Because you said if you put like a price ceiling above what they're already paying, there's no price ceiling. So that's what they're paying, and that's how much the government's saying they can.
So would that keep the consumer service laws?
Yeah, I think maybe all of this.
Yeah. Or are they willing to pay? If they're willing to pay that, well, I guess they're willing to pay
Assuming that suppliers cut down
So I
on
think it's
that. Would be that whole thing? Or
Yeah.
would it
basically that the area underneath this trap is full. Or it might be that this is how much this
and then this is like
this is how much people are willing to
So do
pay.
you think it's this?
like is like adding on to it.
Now that they have the prices, they are going to want to add that.
Because they were willing to, if there was no ceiling, they would be willing to pay like whatever, like 1,000, and they paid 800, so it's still like a good deal. So it's like this is a good deal. But now they were willing to pay 1,000, and they're getting it for 500, so it's like an amazing deal.
Yeah, 50
This point
Does that make sense?
that's
Because we have a shortage, so suppliers might cut. So there's that. So there's less of a grab to buy. But people are willing to pay a lot more on that point on the demand curve. So there's
Okay.
so think about
That where it starts?
think about
trying to
this
make
quantity, right?
Does that make sense? Let's just be theoretical.
That's an important point to get started. So look at this quantity right here. Look back at your notes and
Like, I mean,
figure
I
out
might
what's
be
going
wrong.
on there.
That's what I think it is.
What's going on
Well, I
right
guess
there?
you didn't get me
That's
set
important.
in there, or else we could like actually figure
Point
it
to
out.
really kick off this analysis. Yeah.
Little tiny
That's looking pretty good. So look at this point has some significance. So look at this point has some significance.
What point has
Go back and look at what we had before. So I've been trying to go around and put, yeah, good, okay, and that's not quite identified right, but you're on the right track.
This is the one from last time. So just copy it.
Okay. Oh yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
So that's significant now for the consumer surplus. So think about that
And
point.
transparent is what the consumer is willing to pay. And
Think about that. Identify that
Yes,
quantity.
you did.
they're only on the
Identify that quantity.
I'm gonna reread this so I can see.
I say the consumer surplus is zero.
Right there.
Yellow. Hey, what did you get?
There. So what you have shaded is not correct. But think about what's going on right
Yeah, but
there.
they're only allowed, yeah, but they're only allowed to pay 500.
So ceiling.
They're still willing to pay a
Back
lot
on
more.
track. Good.
Just because they're not allowed
So yeah,
to.
you're on the right track. Now what is
So
that?
that means
What is that quantity?
feeling
What is that
getting
quantity? We don't have
this
numbers
margin right
associated. Well, we did from the other day. I think we actually have numbers. Okay, so let's get back to the board here. You guys
Yeah,
got
it's
some
okay.
time
Now
to
I'm thinking
noodle
about
this.
the price ceiling.
I tried to identify on a lot of your papers so you can share with your neighbor.
Yes.
What is going on at this intersection point right here?
My new supply.
The supply that's in the market, right? That's the quantity supplied at that amount. Now, why is that significant? Now, we had an 80 here, maybe, in our papers before, why is that significant for the figuring out what the consumer surplus is?
That's how much is out there to buy.
That's how much is out there to buy, that's right. And so if you look back at the definition, it's the difference between what consumers are willing to pay and what they actually pay. What's that last part? Because that's the most important. For each unit consumed. Remember, they want to buy this many, 120, but they're not going to get them, right? So they want to buy this amount, but what they actually buy is what's available, and the amount available is only 80. So, starting from left to right then, my technique that I advise you to do, The difference between what you're willing to pay and what you actually pay for each unit consumed. Willing, actual. Willing, actual. Willing, actual. Willing, actual. Willing, actual. Willing, actual. Stops. That's your consumer surplus. We've got a little trapezoid we're working with. If we had enough information in order to calculate this, you'd have to calculate maybe the area of this little rectangle plus the area of that triangle to get the full consumer surplus area. But it is still the area, and that's the value. Now, some of you had this area identified, which is correct for something, just not consumer surplus. Producer surplus. The difference between what the consumers are getting and what the minimum amount they must get. Actual minimum, actual minimum, actual minimum, all the way out to the amount that they're supplying. So that is producer surplus. All right. So that, by the way, your homework assignment for Sunday for this chapter is posted, so you guys can get started on that anytime. It's not due till Sunday, but I encourage you to get a jump on it. And we'll be, that's it for chapter 5. We'll be working with that type of material, though, as we go into chapter 6.